First of all, let me thank you for this opportunity to reach across the world. I am in the United States now. I would have been interested in being with you in person. It was difficult under the present circumstances, but I hope that through these virtual means, we can still have a conversation and I can offer you something that might be of interest. My topic, after discussing with the organizers about folklore and the kinds of things that you're interested in, is mediating the folkloric text, and particularly how digital communication changed tradition. I have worked with traditional kinds of texts as well as asking questions about the internet and digital communication. And I like to look at it especially in terms of tradition, which I think is the core of folklore studies. First, we have to ask, particularly for folklorists, of what is a text and then what is a folkloric text. What you're seeing in the background is an actual display that is in a store devoted to hunting, where you can push that button and a robotic storyteller will tell a story to the passers-by. Text, of course, is in English. It comes from the Latin for a woven thing, something that is indeed put together, if you will, and using the triple characteristics suggested by Alan Dundes. We often connect text to context, what is around the woven thing, what is around the text, as well as texture, and that is the style or the substance of that material. The question is a text as a visual item read within a book? Is it heard, especially with the idea of oral text, or is it viewed as a classifiable and comparable object? And the part of the idea of text, and why folklorists as well as literary scholars have worked for it, is because it has form, or we give it form, which then makes it comparable and structurable, and we assume its stability. The complication of calling a text folkloric is that we add the idea of traditional, even though traditional is somewhat of a vague concept. And particularly when we talk about text, perhaps more so than other kinds of criteria, we're often talking about items that have a multiple existence and that vary. Often folklorists add the component of transmission, although they may argue whether in order to be traditional, it has to be across time or temporal, or whether folklore that is transmitted across space is equally traditional. And that is something I'm going to be discussing, particularly with the internet, which tends to be more spatial rather than temporal. And in recent years, we've been concerned more with the performance aspects of text. So before they get onto a page or are documented, how is it performed within a group, and how does the audience react to that? This has raised, I would say, in the last 20 years, somewhat of a crisis in terms of definition. Previously, we had assumed that folklore was oral literature in its basis, and then there was this notion that we should expand beyond the notion of literary text to include different kinds of artistic communication, whether that's in the form of gesture or in custom. And this is Dan Benamos's idea of artistic communication in small groups that has been challenged, especially, I think, because of digital communication and the notion that we don't just work with small groups, but large groups. And many of the kinds of folklore that you have documented and others have documented, is functional, not just artistic. Well, some people have come up with the idea that it's informal as opposed to formal or academic culture. I don't find that binary very useful, because you can also have traditional aspects within formal organizations and within culture. So what I have proposed is traditional knowledge, to try to draw attention to the cognitive aspects of folklore and the idea that each and every one of us has folklore. It's just not located in a special class of people, and that in order for it to be engaged with people, it is drawing from and put into practice. It is an active kind of expression. Well, this has raised, especially when we started talking about digital communication in the 1980s, what the differences are between what we think of as natural kinds of communication and transmission, or analog culture, or digital, and many people would say artificial texts. And perhaps as a prologue, and also to relate to the audience that I have here, I have a short video to play of an attempt to introduce storytelling in Islamabad, with the idea that young people today have lost this appreciation for storytelling, and yet it's still a very important part of their education.
In the suburbs of Islamabad, a special day awaits these students. Their school has invited a storyteller.
Assalamu alaikum. कैसे हैं आप लोग? कौन-कौन रेडी है गाली सुनने के लिए? अरे वाह, ये तो बड़े अच्छे बच्चे हैं.
Today, he's telling the story of The Little Prince by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry in Urdu, the national language of Pakistan.
कोई पौधा आया और वो एक दिन मैंने उसको देखा तो मैंने उस पर पानी डाल दिया कि थोड़ा सा बड़ा हो तो समझ आए क्या है. कुछ अगले दिन एक खूबसूरत सा उसमें से गुलाब निकला. वो ऐसे जाकर छोटा सा देखता है, उसने तो पहली दफा देखा होता ना. वो उसको देखता है, कहता है तुम कितने प्यारे हो. तो वो गुलाब उसको कहता है, हाँ वो तो मैं हूँ.
बहुत अच्छे लगे सर, आपने इतनी अच्छी उसके साथ एक्टिंग की है, उसके साथ आपने वो रोल प्ले किया, बहुत अच्छा सर आपने जो किया.
Naveed Ahsan Gundel works with the publishing house StoryKid, specializing in using interactive content in education.
When children listen to stories, they start visualizing them, and that develops their creativity.
Well, some of you may question the authenticity of this kind of storytelling, but I think there are many lessons from this little segment about the dynamic aspect of storytelling and how it engages different senses, and in fact, a different kind of cognitive response to words and to information than they gather. We can call, we can call what you've seen analog, in the sense that it's non-mechanical. As you see in the photograph here, it is of a human who is conveying the kind of plot and the kinds of characters that make up a story. It is imperfect. It will be gathered from memory and then transmitted not in an exact reproducible form. It is embodied. We usually connect it to a person, and to, as you saw here, what we would call kinetic kinds of signals or nonverbal communication, as well as verbal. And we have a sense of its wholeness, that we recognize that it's a story, not only made up of words, but something frames it so that we recognize it as an integral whole. The contrast that's often given for digital communication as it arose in the 1980s is that it is precise, it is reproducible, and ironically can be reproduced exactly, even though it may vary in the components it has. And it is made up of a binary of numbers, and hence the idea of digital, which comes from the idea of digits or fingers. And as I will argue, and what the person mentioned about story, which is fascinating to think about, particularly with the development of folklore studies, is that it is imaged, it is visualized. The storyteller here claimed that even though he was telling a story, what he was trying to evoke was having the children visualize the story in their own heads. The rise of digital texts on the internet, often connected to visual images, raises the point that maybe what we're looking at, even though it involves speech, when put together with this kind of communication, is between writing and orality. It is a new space for communication that we had not encountered previously. It might be akin to indirect speech, as we study in linguistics, and the idea that people are saying something, but they may mean something else. It is referential, if you will, or making a reference, often, in fact, metaphorical. And in many cases, it's also an example of transference because of the notion that it is extending cognitive concepts and externalizing them. And I promise I will give some examples of this shortly. Part of the significance, I argue, of folklore is that it falls into the idea of themic or symbolic communication. Themic comes from Greek mythology. Theme was the goddess of rumor, and she would tell stories, she would repeat them and transmit them. Thadic is routine kinds of communication. That's not to say it can't be folkloric, but there are things that would be more associated with habit. You might say, how are you? You might shake hands, not necessarily as a symbolic or meaningful gesture, but something that you have created through routine. I have discussed this in relation to both analog and digital work, first in folklore and the internet, that I hope you will know, that tried to ask the question of whether folklore should be interested in the internet and how it relates to traditional kinds of communication, and then developed it through explaining traditions with a special connection to tradition. So what has the internet done to our notion of culture and communication? I would say there are four ways. One, that folklore as tradition works along the axes of the individual and the mass and global. Before I told you that there was an emphasis on folklore in small groups, in village life, in a small ethnic group, a gathering in a cafe, and so forth. One of the things that the internet has introduced is both that you can express your individuality more than you did before, but you're also speaking to the entire cyber universe. There is this notion of a mass global scale. Second is that folklore as tradition in a digital mode is intentional, that the individuals make a point of creating tradition rather than following tradition, even though we as folklorists may recognize patterns across time. And another notion is that it is not meaningless, as some previous generations had imagined, that it was some kind of a survival of rituals of the long lost past, but that we do it to get certain outcomes, perhaps for social bonding. perhaps as a release, perhaps as entertainment. And third, that folklore as tradition is mediated. There was this notion of that folklore is natural and spontaneous. And yet I think our folklore studies have shown that mediation has not displaced folklore, but given it new life, but also created new forms. And last is the question of vernacularity, which has increasingly been used. And I'd love to have a discussion with you about it. I am not so fond of the word vernacular. I think it comes about because the transmission process is often lost when we study the internet, because we're looking at the screen and we're not aware of how it came to be, as we might be if we were doing observational field work. And so people use the word vernacular because it's vague, but I worry that it also means that it's primitive and that it is expressive, and there's something modern about it, so that it is not a repetition of old patterns, but something that is being reshaped. And this is the idea of moving more to the keyword of practice rather than performance or literary studies previously. Well, part of the task or the challenge of looking at texts in this new mode of tradition is how we can describe it as an event or behavior or cognition. And often we're looking for repetition and how that creates a frame. It may not be a physical frame, but it becomes a social one where we recognize something different is happening within that frame from what is outside. And one of the functions of folklore is to construct that frame. Here's a very short example of a ritual that many people know of called Bloody Mary, which is often among adolescent girls in the United States. And they will go to the bathroom, they will turn out the lights, they will light a candle, and they will repeat the name Bloody Mary, often with a background of a story that Bloody Mary died, and then she will come back as a ghost if you repeat her name 3 times. So take a look at this context and you can decide, is this a ritual or is it a text embodied within a play frame?
Bloody Mary. Bloody Mary. Bloody Mary.
You get the idea. So there's not much of a text, but it implies a whole story, a whole narrative around why this girl is going into a bathroom. And I should say, very often it's common at sleepovers, as we tend to have in the United States, for the girls to do it together. And often there is a bang or somebody we'll bang it and everybody screams. This play frame is very important because putting an air of play around it affords some kind of license to do and question things that you could not otherwise. Reality is somewhat suspended in this frame, and often even afterwards, it's something to talk about. And another use of digital communication I might mention is that people will take videos. We're seeing a new genre of videos confirming these rituals and these narratives to say there really was a banging on the door after she said Bloody Mary 3 times. Notice nothing happened after once or twice. So that's a whole genre that we can talk about, and that is the confirming narrative through YouTube and video. Play also literally can be very important, particularly in the childhood years, to develop a sense, a cognitive sense of the function of folklore. Often we study the elderly for the folklore, but part of, I think, the whole notion of practicing cognition is to look at how folklore competencies develop. And one of the ways is through play, and often gender specific and group specific play. This is jump rope, often done by girls, and hence the questioning of many of the rhymes or the texts that are done, that within this play frame, there is an anticipation of the future, especially of giving birth, of sexuality, and of growth and maturity through this notion of play. One of the classic examples that folklorists argue a lot, at least in the United States, is Cinderella dressed in yellow. Here is a fairy tale figure, and the rhyme goes, even though it's not known as a fairy tale, it's known as a rhyme, but it's Cinderella dressed in yellow, went upstairs to kiss a fellow, kissed a snake, made a mistake, came down with a bellyache. And the question becomes of this transference. Is this symbolic, and is the performer aware of the symbolism? Alan Dundes has argued that this represents a fear or an anticipation of pregnancy, because it got kissed by a snake and came up with a bellyache, hence pregnancy in these terms, which is not apparently overly sexual. Others say that this is a linguistic device to provide rhythm for this kind of play. So these are the kinds of works we're doing that get away from the notion that the performers themselves know the meaning, that there is something called a introspective illusion. I will talk more about that folklore was largely based on, of why we did interviews that we're starting to get away from. And part of this is to understand the actions of posting, the actions of mediation. So I did have, in explaining traditions, a speculation, for example, about sitting at a desk and the idea of expressiveness at a desktop, and this notion that it is ejective, much like going to the bathroom, but we use it on the screen in the form of words, and how things have changed with the mobile device, which then allows us to transcend place. That in essence, we are not only bodiless when we post, but then we are placeless as well, which takes away from the notion of culture, which is based upon the ground. It's based upon rootedness, which again changes the equation of transmission. So it raises the question, if we don't have place as a context, and we don't have bodies as a context, what contexts count in digital communication? Is it still folklore if we don't have those components? And in my theorizing, I have this hypothesis that the context that tends to count is the image that we produce, and then the references that we make to those images about the intention, which is often vague, as I will show you shortly. I also want to talk about another context, and that is the materiality of the text. We think that the internet is immaterial. It is simultaneously posted, and it doesn't have shape the way you might in a book that, for example, the children in that Islamabad example were given so that they can see the story as well as hear it. One of the distinctive things I know as someone who's interested in material culture, for example, are decorated trucks, which do have patterns, if you will. And then the question is, well, do they tell a story? It could be to an outsider that they are random kinds of decoration. They seem very busy. But in working with informants and tradition bearers, they can read these trucks much as they read text to see what they mean. They increasingly become competitive, and they transform the mechanical item into a cultural one. And they suggest then the texts have shape and structure, and the shape of the truck is important as well as the structure of the items that are posted within it. A classic example of this is from the Hmong in Southeast China and also in Laos. They came to the United States as well, who created story cloths. They have an oral language, and they would preserve their historic memories of the former land within these cloths. These triangles that you see here represent the mountains of Laos. That may not be clear unless, again, you read the interior cognition that those people have. And another thing that is very important for them to preserve is not only their historical memories, but their folk tales, especially with the local context, the local references, because those may not be apparent to subsequent generations in their new land, such as the United States. We can look at other kinds of forms in addition to these and ask the question about inside cognition and what that means. What you are looking at is a page that is in Persian, and this layout of the page is known as a carpet kind of pattern. And while it may seem odd, the way that it is written out, it is intentional in the diagonal lines, and it references the carpet culture of that area. And in fact, words themselves take on an artistic work so that the letters become artistic statements, and particularly with this reference, for example, to the hand, which is in the Tulit script. It's from Algeria and Morocco. It's made out of brass. And the hand is not only a signal of the culture, but also of good luck and warding off the evil eye. So you have a lot of folklore that's wrapped up in it. This made me think too of work that I did with gravestones, and many people would document the history and who is buried. And I started to look at the relationship at the end of life, this gravestone, to the beginning of life. This is a certificate of birth and baptism among Pennsylvania Germans who were isolated in Pennsylvania from their homeland in the Rhineland. And yet I noticed that there were structural similarities and wanted to ask the question, why would this represent the life cycle? And what I did is structure it out, which I think we can do with the material text. And notice there were 7 different stages that represented of going from the ground to the heaven up above. M stands for a motif, this tulip motif, and T is a text, and it reflects a religious belief that the text is what is central and that you enhance the text with the decorations or the motifs around it. And this is somewhat in contrast to Catholic texts. Another quick example that might not be apparent is the understanding of the textual process as well as the outcome. We tended to especially stress the outcome. This is someone who carves chains out of a single piece of wood. He's a wood carver, and people are fascinated by these wooden objects that look like chains. But as I found that the trick, so to speak, of why they are appealing is because the ball inside this is not carved out, but actually carved in. And there is a narrative, if you will. This was done by elderly men, and this was a time of their life that they felt that they were underappreciated, and through these kinds of objects, they were literally saying in the process that we want to be cut into society. And we can extend this even further to other variations. This is the Chinese dragon or puzzle ball, which looks like a whittler's trick. As you could see, there are balls within the balls. And so the question as you hold it in your hand is, what is this about? How is this done from a technical point of view? But it is also supposed to represent dragons going in and out of the earth, which relates to Chinese mythology about dragons being responsible for the origins of the earth. Moving ahead, I saw the increase of image culture, whether that's from television or art, or our increasing reliance on graphics and advertising. There's this notion that we are bombarded with images all around us. And one of the folkloric examples of this is something called a droodle, D-R-O-O-D-L-E. And the idea is someone would show you a very simple drawing or image and ask you what it is. And again, using the play frame, drawing attention that it's not what it appears to be, which is something about the superficiality of image culture and the impersonality of it, and that happens with a reliance on sight rather than the folk world of touch. So what is depicted here? 63 examples of a camel passing by a window. These droodles, by the way, are from Estonia, but they're found all over the world. This is a hill, which is seen between the humps of a camel. So you can see variations on these themes. This is a clothesline and the humps of 2 camels behind the window. So some of you may say this is absurd, but again, there's a message, a transference that is occurring with this meta message about image culture. And this one that had the most, 700 variants, a giraffe behind the window. We can talk about this later. Well, I see connections historically with this and the rise of the photocopier, which seemed to be tailor-made for visual kinds of products, even though it was supposed to be for documents, but very quickly it got used for visuals, and often with these double entendres because sexuality is natural. And you could see here reproduction is fun with a rabbit that is supposed to be very fertile, and a reference to the technology. There is reference to the bathroom, again, as a place where people are themselves. The idea is that you give an impression in this new corporate kind of world, but really you get to know what people are like within the natural systems of the bathroom. So often in English, someone who has to go to the bathroom uses the euphemism nature calls. And this is the reference here of a binary between nature and the artificial of new modern kinds of work. The transmission is often through what we call secretaries. Now they're administrative support, but you can see this is making fun that there is a kind of hierarchy here, and there is a power relationship, whether that's gendered or occupational, that is also represented, and probably especially shown here. This is the corporate eagle and the mouse, often thought as a rodent, and a pest is at the bottom. And we often talk about folklore as a projection or transference of anxiety. You know, what generates folklore, which is a question that we need to ask. And you see this one about zebras losing their stripes and saying, like a worker, this is a symbolism for a worker, I think it's stress. The computer is also referenced, as you can see here. Again, this binary between nature and technology and the corporation here, making a comparison of a computer to a bathroom input here, the floppy disk of the lid, the application software. Here you get a message of hit any key to continue. And we see a structure emerging where the observation, the image, needs to be explained. And there is a paradox or a contribution, a contradiction, I should say, that then you as an observer resolve in your mind. That is the narrative. Alan Dundes made a lot of the contrast, for example, of this figure who has a screw through his stomach, and it is a male, and work hard and you shall be rewarded. This is the ideal, and this is the reality of what occurs of the average worker who he claimed was being screwed by technology. Well, coming up more to the present is the phenomenon of memes. And although some people think that memes came out of the blue and is totally new, I see a connection between those photocopied broadsides that you saw that were common in the 70s and 1980s with the new memes, because they set up this structural incongruity all the time. So open window to let fly out, it flew out, and this is a baby, but it's representing an adult who's very proud of his accomplishment. Cats are all over memes, launched 1,000 memes, hated every one of them. The kind of grumpiness with technology, and people often ask, why are there so many cats in memes? And there is this idea that it's rebellious. Cats are harder to control. And this is the notion of the open web. And the other thing that's folkloric or transferred is the notion that then the machines have a life of their own and we talk to them. Never let your computer know that you are in a hurry. Computers can smell fear. They slow down if they know that you are running out of time. And there are characters, whether they're heroes or anti-heroes, is something to consider. This is Bill Gates, of course, the founder of Microsoft, and these kinds of repetition of the image around language that's, again, suggests a binary with either sexuality or some kind of natural kind of language that is unexpected or incongruous is very common here. So what is the process? As I said, paying attention to the process. Well, the process is that you would have these meme generators, as you could see here, and basically you would write here and it shows up. So you're writing, but the intent is to be unofficial. So again, it's between orality and writing, which is a new challenge, I would say, for folklorists. Well, I'm going to challenge you, and I don't pretend to know Pakistan very well, but if you follow my argument, then I should be able to learn something about Pakistan or Pakistanis through memes. But the question is it understandable with the behavioral or play frames that one needs to know in order to understand this? We talk about the internet being global, but is this then localized knowledge? For example, here, what tourists in Pak think we do. What is that a reference to? What India thinks we do. Cricket, oh, okay. There's also this notion of my parents expect me to do, and the aspiration of doctors and engineers, and also the notion of what others think about, and that is this specter of terrorism that you see here. Then maybe others can figure this out from the images, but there are others that seem much more esoteric. So it raises the question of whether memes are global or whether they can be localized, and then localized to whom and what the reference is. So here is when you wake up Sunday morning and can smell that mom made biryani. That is not going to be knowledge that one is going to have in the United States and even in large parts of Europe. Or here's another one, which I do relate to, having had a neighbor from Pakistan who used to bring food over that my taste buds could not handle, but you could see these kinds of images and even celebrity culture. So this is my stomach after having eaten Pakistani food, and you can see the expression here is very dry, as it had no effect whatsoever. And then later on, perhaps some of you can comment on this further. It also raises the question about English as a global language because of digital communication. Does this change the tradition? Here is a meme about that with someone, if English is not your native language, don't make memes in English. This is Michael Jordan, an internationally known sports celebrity who, through Photoshop, is made to look Pakistani. And even some memes that either anglicize the language to make it even more esoteric. So you're visualizing connection. All right, so let me summarize, and I know I'm going quickly, but I hope I can raise discussions or have time for questions. We have traditional texts that I'm suggesting should be looked at in terms of the visuals as well. This is, for example, a text from the 17th century where it's from poetry from Rumi, and yet the knowledge of the language is also related to the paintings that are there, so that we should be analyzing the role as we think about the internet and even carrying it back to some of our traditional texts in terms of the generative technology, whether that's in printing, that's in art, whether that's through the cell phone, and to try to figure out what the intention is and the notion of diffusive virality, which now we talk about in the colloquium, oh, that meme went viral. But let's think about that in folkloric terms. Who does it travel to, and can we trace the patterns of transmission that they're not always comprehensive? They may travel in certain circles that may be by gender, by group, and by occupation. It forces us to rethink collection and fieldwork, particularly when we work with texts. And I would argue that ironically, while many people predicted the displacement of texts because of the internet, it's heightened the textualization because now we text things rather than tell someone what we're going to do. That forces us to read and decipher all kinds of texts and to understand what the differences in the transmission are. This is, for example, a typescript done with a typewriter, one of the first mediated traditions. It is a joke. It is fake or humorous kinds of definitions. So, for example, a blackout, the reason a girl is apt to get blown into maternity without ever knowing who it was. And this would not be in a regular dictionary, but this was typed up and then circulated. Well, that raises the question then, what happens when we go to what is ironically a mediated oral medium that invites more kinds of oral as well as textual communication? One of the challenges is something that I have called the introspective illusion, that previously when I started out, I would interview someone and ask what this meant to them. That is very difficult to do with the text, so we have to figure that out, and we realize that there's a bias when people think they have direct insight into the origins of their mental state. Because of these patterns of transference and civilization, there is a role for the folklorist, not just to record what the performer or the practitioner said it meant, but to understand the structures and the context and the symbols so that we can say what is outside of the awareness, indeed, of the center of the performer. And this is, I think, a shift then in folklore, which increasingly was looking at the artist, the unusual or exceptional artist, and paying more attention to repeatability and the question of why people repeat themselves rather than why they create great works. And this suggests that we have to look at the term traditional text as part of material and visual culture, not just separated out between literature and the material, but in fact to integrate them as part of the whole. I appreciate your attention. I hope I've given you some ideas that are interesting to you. And what I have here in this last slide, if you're interested to read some more of my articles, I'd like you to know some of my books, but I have posted some of my articles in Academia EDU and ResearchGate. Thank you very much.
Since we are already running out of time, we will only take 2 questions from the audience. Can you ask the questions? Thank you, Dr. Bronner. I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Or maybe you can put the question in the chat, speaking of text.
You cannot hear me?
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Thank you for this very interesting and enlightening presentation. You made it more interesting by using examples from a Pakistani context. We are currently engaged in a research project to translate and digitize some folk literature genres in 7 different languages of Pakistan. But you, as you talked about this crisis in the definition of folklore and folk literature, we are currently going through that crisis. While we are trying to select data to be translated, we are unsure as to whether we should put this particular song or this particular poem into folk literature or not, because there have been controversies. Things are now being sung, they are being broadcasted, they are being written, they are no more oral. The writers are now known. There are no more multiple versions. And some folk singers in Pakistan have recently objected when some pop stars started singing their lyrics, and they said that this is not folk. So can you be more specific in telling us as to how should we take that decision as to what should we include in folk literature? I'm just talking about folk literature, not the rest of the folklore. Thank you.
Certainly, that's a fair question, and it's a difficult one. And it's not easy to put up hard and fast walls between the folk and the non-folk, if you will. Part of the cognitive idea is that all of us have elite ideas, we have popular ideas that are gained through media, and we have folk ideas. And there are people who believe that the folk ideas are disappearing, but they're there. So I would say that what we're trying to do increasingly, or I also have this archival challenge, is to note how the work is being practiced. So, am I okay? Can you still hear me?
You can continue, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. The reason why I am attracted to the notion of practice is that when Disney does a fairy tale, I would not categorize this as folk, not just because it's commercialized, but because it's not in practice, if you will, or there's not any evidence that this was functional in the way that it was presented. And so that is the rule of thumb that I have, that would then note the idea of traditional knowledge, which then is put into practice or drawn from it. Having said that, one of the topics that my colleague Libby Tucker, a folklorist in the United States, has looked at is then how school children will take some of those popular images and folklorize it for themselves. So they will do parodies, they will do skits, dramatic renditions for themselves, but it becomes a form of practice among them, and that complicates things. But why I'm suggesting that we need to integrate the material and the visual with the notion of how these kinds of items are practiced. That does become more difficult when we look at historic texts to ask the question of what kinds of clues are put into them about how these poems or how the songs are actually used in everyday life. If you have that kind of evidence, you have a strong frame to be able to make those kinds of decisions. And then we finally, let me say, we have to ask, what's the purpose of the digitization or of compiling this evidence? And I would argue, since there is an overlap between popular culture, that the folk aspect is important to draw out because it suggests a transmission process, a learning process that is different from the popular. And that's what we want to analyze. There are scholars, I have colleagues who don't believe that the division between folk, popular, and elite is valid. It's all cultural. And we should all just throw it all together. But I'm still an advocate for making some separations so that we can do analyses, if that's human or even computer generated now with analyses of materials that share in common a transmission process, a repeatability, as well as a practice that it is used for that then makes them comparable. I hope that's helpful.